And so just 1 second while it starts.
Hi, good afternoon everyone, and thank you for joining our session on insolvency statistics and COVID-19. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm Kate Palmer and I'm the Head of Statistics for the Insolvency Service, and I'm co-presenting the session with John Perrott, who is Head of the Analysis and Performance team in the Insolvency Service. And our session this afternoon is being moderated by Laura Bardsley, who will be picking up your questions via the chat function on the top right hand corner of your screen. So any questions that you'd like to pose to us, pop them in there and we'll aim to answer as many questions as we can today in the time available. I'm not managing the slides today. John's going to be clicking through the slide pack whilst I do my side of the presentation this afternoon. So apologies if there is a slight delay, but we will work through the presentation slides as timely as possible. So the content of the presentation this afternoon, the presentation has 5 parts to it. I'm going to start with providing a very brief overview of some of our routine insolvency statistical publications for anyone who's not familiar. I'll then move on to present company and individual insolvency trends over the past decade until the end of 2019, or what we now term pre-pandemic trends. Many of you may already be familiar with these historical trends, but it's worth revisiting them as a refresher before we jump into the current trends and how they may have changed since the start of the pandemic. For part 3, I'll be handing over to John, who is going to summarise the broader impact of the pandemic on the economy and highlight some of the government measures that have been put into place to support businesses and individuals during this time. And then I will talk through current insolvency trends seen this year and how trends have changed since the start of the pandemic. Moving on to part 4, lessons from the past, John will present insolvency trends seen during and in the few years following previous recessions and how these trends compare with what we are currently seeing in today's recession. And then finally, we'll be looking forwards to consider what all this means for insolvency in the future. Next slide, John, please. So first up, our publications. So the Insolvency Service publishes a wide range of statistics presenting numbers and rates of company and individual insolvency. We also publish additional information on outcomes of individual voluntary arrangements and further detail on the location, age and gender of individuals who have entered insolvency. The heat map there just illustrates our latest statistics published on the location of individuals who have entered insolvency by local authority, for example. Additionally, we publish information on outcomes resulting from the enforcement activities of the insolvency, such as director disqualifications. Whilst our routine publications provide a vast amount of information, there was an immediate need for the publication of more timely statistics on companies and individuals entering insolvency following the first UK lockdown on 23rd of March this year, in response to the coronavirus pandemic. The first full month of UK lockdown was April, and by mid-May we published the first in a new series of monthly statistics which present key top-level summaries of companies and individuals that have entered insolvency since the emergence of the pandemic. And we'll be having a little look at the latest findings from this monthly series later on. All of our publications can be found on the gov.uk website. The link to our collection of statistics is provided here, or you can simply enter Insolvency Service official statistics into your search engine. So before we jump into current trends, let's have a recap of pre-pandemic insolvency trends. So this chart presents annual numbers of company insolvencies during the 10-year period 2010 to 2019. As you can see, the overall numbers of company insolvencies decreased year on year between 2011 and 2015. There are two lines on this chart from 2015, and the bold line continues to present the numbers of registered company insolvencies each year. However, from 2016, numbers were inflated as a result of bulk insolvencies. These were large volumes of connected companies that entered creditors' voluntary liquidation as a result of government changes in tax rules. And when bulk insolvencies are removed, the trend from 2015 to 2017 is actually stable, with increases seen in 2018 and 2019, as shown by the dotted line. The number of total company insolvencies in 2019 was 18% higher than the number seen 2 years earlier in 2017. As you can see from the next line on the slide there, that represents creditors' voluntary liquidations, or CVLs. CVLs really drove the overall trend in company insolvencies over the time period. And as I just mentioned, it was the CVLs that experienced bulk insolvencies. And so again, we've presented both the overall numbers and the underlying numbers following removal of these bulk insolvencies. And similarly to the overall total, the numbers of CVLs in 2019 was also 18% higher than 2017. Moving on to another form of company insolvency, another procedure is a compulsory liquidation. Annual numbers of companies entering compulsory liquidation steadily decreased from the start of the period to 2015, and then remained fairly stable to 2019 at an average of around 3,000 compulsory liquidations per year. Finally, other types of company insolvency collectively steadily decreased year on year to 2017 and saw small increases in 2018 and 2019. These other types of company insolvency include company voluntary arrangements, administrations, and receivership appointments. They're presented together here, as in recent years they've made up no more than 13% of all company insolvencies. However, our published stats do provide more granular detail on all types of company insolvency. So this next slide presents overall numbers of individual insolvencies over the same 10-year time period. And as you can see, overall numbers decreased year on year to 2015, and then they turned a corner and followed almost the same linear pattern back up towards 2010 levels by 2019. The overall total number of individual insolvencies was predominantly driven by the volume of individual voluntary arrangements, or IVAs, over the time period, particularly since 2014. The number of IVAs in 2019 almost doubled from the volume seen in 2015. Annual numbers of bankruptcies, however, decreased year on year until around 2016. And it's not easy to see on this chart, but there have been small annual increases in bankruptcies since around 2016, and these increases are likely driven by changes to the bankruptcy application process. So individuals wishing to make themselves bankrupt no longer have to submit their application to the court. A more simplified online process whereby applications are now assessed by an adjudicator within the Insolvency Service may likely have contributed to the small increases seen in the most recent years. The biggest driver, however, behind the change in bankruptcy trends was the introduction of debt relief orders in 2009. Debt relief orders are a way of debtors having their debts written off if they have relatively low level of debt and few assets. So individuals eligible to proceed down the DRO route may have therefore opted for this instead, resulting in fewer debtor bankruptcy applications since 2009. The final line on the chart represents the debt relief orders, or DROs. And annual numbers of debt relief orders appear to have remained fairly stable on that chart, partly due to the scaling. Again, it's not really obvious to see on the chart, but the annual numbers of DROs have actually again increased slightly since 2015, when the eligibility criteria changed. For example, the maximum debt level increased from 15,000 to 20,000, and the maximum asset limit increased from £300 to £1,000. These changes to the eligibility criteria have meant that more individuals could access this form of debt relief. Okay, so that really concludes the summary of historical insolvency trends seen over the past decade. It was really more of a refresher into what we've seen. If you're particularly interested in any more granular detail of historical trends, then please do check out our statistics or get in touch with the statistics team. So at this point, I'm going to hand you over to John, who is going to summarise the wider impact of the coronavirus pandemic, including the impact on economic growth.
Thank you, and hopefully I'm not falling into the mute trap, so I'll press on. I'm going to talk now about what we've seen in the data in 2020 so far, starting with the broad economic context before handing back then to Kate to talk about recent trends in insolvency. Starting with economic growth. The effects of coronavirus on economic growth began to be felt in March this year. On the 16th of March, we were advised to avoid all non-essential travel and contact with others. And then on the 23rd of March, the instruction was given to stay at home, that first UK lockdown. And this led to a contraction at the end of Q1 of this year, January to March, of 2.5%, followed by another fall of nearly 20% as the UK entered a technical recession in Q2. And these falls in economic output all occurred in March and April, with the economy starting to grow again from May onwards. The Office for National Statistics observes a loss of momentum in the recovery since July, except in certain sectors such as the accommodation and food services, which were boosted in August by the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Changes in economic growth have previously been closely linked to numbers of corporate insolvencies, with economic contraction usually leading to increases in business failures. We'll come back to this a bit later. Turning to the impacts on employment, the latest labour market statistics show that redundancies have been increasing since June this year. Over 300,000 people were made redundant between July and September, which is slightly higher than the peak seen in the 2008 to 09 recession period. And the ONS's experimental statistics showed particularly strong increases in redundancies in the first 2 weeks of September. Looking at employment, data from HM Revenue and Customs estimate that payroll employment has fallen by nearly 700,000 employments since March, with the bulk of that decrease happening in April. Lockdown, as you'll be no doubt aware, meant the temporary closure of many businesses. This began to unwind in the summer, with ONS data showing nearly 90% of businesses trading more recently. However, the latest data were collected after the new national restrictions began in England, and they show trading levels back to the levels seen at the end of July to early August. Businesses and individuals have been able to access support for their employees, including the Coronavirus Job Retention or furlough scheme. Take-up of this scheme rose very quickly in March and April, with nearly 9 million employments, over a quarter of total employments, on furlough for almost 2 months. There are some step changes in the data illustrating both the easing of trading restrictions and, from August, the need for employers to contribute to employment costs. This chart only goes up to August because that's the latest available data from HMRC. But even at the end of August, an estimated 3.3 million employments were furloughed, 11% of the total. Furloughing was highest in the arts, entertainment and recreation, accommodation and food, and other, in quotes, other services, where about a quarter to a third of the respective employments were furloughed. This scheme was, of course, expected to have ended by the end of October, but has recently been extended by the Chancellor until next March, with a job support scheme in place thereafter. Linked to this is the self-employment income support scheme, where 2.3 million people had claimed a second grant by the end of September. This too has been extended by the Chancellor. Looking at support to businesses, businesses have been able to access a number of different schemes, and the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, the large business version of this, the Business Bounce Back Loans, and the Future Fund, where the latest available data shows that over 60 billion of loans have cumulatively been paid to businesses. This is also apparent from looking at Bank of England data on the value of outstanding loans to business at the end of each month. This includes both those government-backed but also other commercial loans. Over 2019, calendar year 2019, the value outstanding had been pretty stable, but then loans to large businesses picked up in March, although it's mostly returned to trend. Loans outstanding to small and medium enterprises have increased by about £40 billion since April. And as well as these other high-profile schemes, the Insolvency Service, in collaboration with BEIS, Treasury and others, have worked round the clock to introduce new legislation on corporate insolvency and governance. We had already consulted on these measures and intended to bring them into place in due course, but the government needed to respond to the COVID-19 emergency by giving companies the tools they needed to get through this period and continue trading when the economy emerges, and mitigate insolvencies during the pandemic. The moratorium here provides vital breathing space from creditor enforcement actions while a financially distressed company explores its options for rescue. Restructuring plans help complex companies to restructure their debts, and the suspension of termination clauses will mean that ransom payments to creditors can be avoided. Taken together, these measures bring the UK's insolvency framework in line with international best practice, support viable companies, preserve jobs, and lead overall to better outcomes for creditors. There are also some temporary measures included in the legislation, including a suspension of statutory demands and winding up petitions, in particular to stop aggressive tactics from commercial landlords tipping viable companies into insolvency. And there's also the suspension of wrongful trading liability, which, while that was active, removed the threat to directors of being personally liable and enabling them to use their best efforts to make decisions on trading and future viability in a very, very uncertain trading environment. At that point, I'll hand back to Kate to see what we've seen from the insolvency data.
Thank you, John. Okay, so what has been the fallout of the current situation so far in terms of company and individual insolvency? So this chart presents monthly numbers of company insolvency using data from our new monthly statistical series, and it shows that overall numbers of company insolvencies have reduced since March of this year, when the UK entered its first lockdown. It is important to note here that there is known seasonality in the insolvency data, and this means that in pre-pandemic or normal times, there are peaks and troughs in the data from one time period to another, and therefore we typically make adjustments to the data to account for seasonality so that trends can be made more reliably from one time period to the next. The monthly data used to compile these statistics and this chart that you can see right here have not been seasonally adjusted for several reasons, but mainly due to the resource required each month that would render this information less timely. And for this reason, we only compare one time period with the same period a year ago. So as you can see, as with the annual numbers, the CVLs are also the main driver for our monthly time series as well. And they actually fell 32% when you look at the total numbers of CVLs between April and October this year, and compare that with the number of CVLs registered between April and October last year. Compulsory liquidations have again remained low since March. There was a small peak in July, however, most of these cases had a petition date prior to the first UK lockdown, suggesting that this was actually an artificial peak as petitions were being processed by the courts. The number of compulsory liquidations between April and October this year was 68% lower than during the same period last year. All other types of company insolvency have also remained low since March, with total numbers of other types of company insolvency remaining around 20% lower combined between April and October this year compared to the same period last year. There were immediate short-term effects of the first UK lockdown on insolvency. The average daily number of company insolvencies dropped by over half, from an average of 66 new cases per day to an average of 29 new cases per day throughout the last days of March. This was partly driven by all parties involved having to adjust their working practices. For example, Companies House had to quickly adjust to processing everything digitally, alongside the reduction in court activity to slow the spread of the virus. Average daily numbers of company insolvencies did jump back up to around 60 registrations per day in April, but as you can see from the chart, numbers very quickly dropped off again. The longer term picture so far is that company insolvencies between April and October are overall 1/3 lower than seen in the same period last year. And this reduction is likely to be in part driven by the range of government support put in place to financially support companies and their employees, for example, the furlough scheme, as well as other measures such as those introduced within the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act. Okay, moving on to individual insolvencies. You'll notice that there's no overall total for individual insolvencies on this chart. This is because the data on individual voluntary arrangements are too volatile for a monthly series, and the volatility skews the bankruptcy and DRO figures, so IVAs are presented separately on the next slide, rather than present overall individual insolvencies with an overall total. This chart shows that bankruptcy and DRO volumes have both dropped since March. The numbers of bankruptcies between April and October this year reduced by 37%, and the number of DROs reduced by 32% when compared with the same period last year. Again, there were immediate short-term effects of the first UK lockdown. The average daily number of registered individual insolvencies almost halved from 195 to 110 in the last few days of March. Average daily cases then did not increase in April. The immediate drop in numbers was again likely to have been mainly driven by practical issues experienced, such as reduced court activity, particularly for credited petition-led bankruptcies. So bankruptcies, there are two types of bankruptcy. You have your debtor applications and creditor petitions, and both creditor petition-led bankruptcies and debtor-led bankruptcies have fallen in numbers since March. The biggest reduction was seen for bankruptcies following creditor petitions. These fell by nearly 75% when comparing figures for April to October this year with the same period a year ago. Collectively, numbers of bankruptcies and DROs are 1/3 lower than seen in the same period last year. And reductions in applications for DROs and debtor applications coincide with announcements of enhanced government financial support, while the fall in creditor petitions may likely have been a result of reduced HMRC enforcement activity and, as I've mentioned in part, a result of reduced operational running of the courts. So as previously mentioned, underlying IVA data are volatile. IVAs are included within our statistics once they're registered with the Insolvency Service, and there can be a time lag between the date on which the IVA is accepted, known as the date of creditor agreement, and the date of registration by licensed insolvency practitioners. Therefore, changes in trends are partly a result of this effect, particularly where registrations straddle the month end. And this can lead to volatility in the data from one month to the next and create difficulty in constituting reliable short-term trends. For example, this peak in May indicates a large increase in IVAs in that month. However, one IVA provider experienced technical issues that resulted in nearly 5,000 IVAs being registered in May that would otherwise have been registered between December 19 and March 20. To try to overcome the volatility, we calculate 3-month rolling averages to smooth the data and try to estimate what the overall trend of IVA registrations might look like if the underlying data were less volatile. However, these figures should also be interpreted with caution. For comparison, this second chart presents seasonally adjusted IVA data as presented within our quarterly statistical series. This indicates that the volume of IVAs in Q3 of this year was the lowest seen since at least Q1 18, which is just the first time period on this particular chart. However, it's harder to determine such trends from the monthly data. So that concludes my summary of recent insolvency trends and how across the board insolvency volumes have reduced since the start of the pandemic. John and I have covered quite a lot so far, so now is probably a good time to address any questions related to the content that we've covered so far in the presentation.
Thank you very much, Kate. Yeah, we have had a couple of questions come in. So the first one says your stats are very helpful, a model for government departments. So thank you to that person for the lovely compliment. The question is, going forward, will you be publishing specific procedure use again, admins, liquidation, CVAs and receivership, but also including Company Act schemes and the SIGA moratoriums, restructuring plans with their own data lines? So not just other insolvencies other than liquidation. This could be very useful for research purposes to break down the various procedures in the graphs, so not just having that other category.
Okay, so our quarterly and monthly statistics do present all types of insolvency separately. For purposes of the presentation and just sort of giving everybody a flavour of how things have changed over time, we have grouped administrations, receiverships together and CVAs, but the underlying numbers that accompany our statistics do have all of those numbers available. We have just also recently started publishing numbers of moratoriums and restructuring plans, and our latest publication does actually provide that information, albeit in text. We haven't got that information currently published in a chart due to the small numbers that we've seen so far. The numbers of moratoriums and restructuring plans sanctioned by the court so far have been relatively low. There have been 2 companies that have obtained a moratorium and 1 company has had a restructuring plan. But the low numbers of cases in each of these new legislative tools since the Act came into force is likely to be a result of the range of government support that's been put into place, as already mentioned before by John, including the range of temporary measures that have recently been extended for a further period. So with all of the government measures that have been put into place, thankfully, very few companies have had to have gone down this road, but the numbers of companies that have had restructuring plans and moratoriums are now published within our statistics. And I hope that helps.
Thank you. And there's another question here. The Charity Commission do not keep stats on insolvent charities. Noting that there may be some jurisdictional issues, could the Insolvency Service consider presenting stats that detail insolvent companies of all types, profit and not-for-profit, so including charitable companies in the breakdowns, as it would be interested to see how many charities are entering insolvency?
Good question.
Shall I come in on that one?
Okay, John, thank you.
So we're limited in terms of the data source that we have. We use Companies House as our primary source for corporate insolvencies, and profit, not for profit, is just not a field that they collect in its current form. There is potentially a means of trying to match against the Charities Commission register, but we've attempted that before. The matching isn't so good, so I think we would probably end up painting a false picture if we try to do that in official stats. So we'd like to, but I don't think it's feasible.
Okay, thank you. And finally, have you conducted any analysis to forecast potential individual insolvencies going forward that may feed into the next section of the presentation?
Yes, I think we'll cover that next, if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so John, you're going to move on to the next bit.
Thanks. So just to sum up, it's pretty clear that insolvencies have been lower during this COVID recession. So I'm going to talk a bit next about what's happened in previous recessions. I'll start by bringing up some shaded sections showing all the technical recessions that have occurred in the UK since 1960. Overlaid, hopefully, on this now is the number of individual insolvencies each quarter. The first point of note, I guess, is that individual insolvency was rare in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Court-based bankruptcy was just about the only route, with a handful of deeds of arrangement. The 1990s recession coincided with an increase and then a new higher baseline level of insolvency. The biggest rate of change in insolvency, however, came outside of a recession period in the mid-2000s, when a large expansion in household lending coincided with a large increase in insolvencies. And more recently, as Kate observed, the increase in individual insolvency since 2015 has been driven largely by growth in individual voluntary arrangements. What we in the Insolvency Service have observed since the late 90s is that changes in insolvency are much more closely linked to changes in household debt than they are to economic growth. Looking at corporate insolvencies, and now the numbers should be read off the right-hand axis. Here, the relationship between economic downturns and increases in insolvencies is more clear than for individual insolvencies, with periods of rapid growth in company failures followed by a levelling off. What's not clear from that chart, though, is that the rate of growth in insolvency each time, because insolvency was pretty rare some decades ago, it's harder to discern that difference. So I'll try and show you in comparable terms what happened during and in the 4 years after each recession, starting with corporate insolvencies. In each of the recessions in the 70s, 80s and 90s, corporate insolvencies grew for over 2 years after that initial economic contraction, excuse my door, reaching roughly twice the level that it had been at the start. The 2008-09 recession was different though. Corporate insolvency peaked more quickly, and then with a lower peak at about 50% higher than it had been pre-contraction. Unlike after previous recessions, insolvencies then started to decrease again and didn't return to pre-recession levels though until 2015. Contrasting against the 2020 recession, the picture to date looks very different with a sustained lower number of insolvencies. Looking at personal insolvency next, the growth in individual insolvency in the 70s to 90s recessions actually are pretty closely correlated to those for company insolvency. However, bankruptcy, as it almost always was, tended to be amongst small business owners, so it was a very different profile. The 2008-09 recession was the first one in which people with consumer debts were in the majority. And unlike prior recessions, there had already been some substantial growth in individual insolvency. Growth therefore didn't peak as high in relative terms as in previous recessions, about 50% higher compared with a doubling or trebling as in previous recessions, but from a much higher base. Insolvencies then started falling again 2 years after that initial economic contraction. And as with company insolvency, numbers this year have dropped, especially after adjusting for that artificial spike that we've seen in May this year. So turning to the future and just circling back to that question that's been taxing me and others inside and outside the insolvency services, what does this mean for insolvencies in the future? And I guess I'm going to start with a spoiler alert. We don't have a firm number, but I'll try and explain a bit around the context that we're looking at. Starting with the outlook for economic growth. This is what the Office for Budget Responsibility thinks or thought might happen to economic growth, with various scenarios with a central view that the UK would return to pre-pandemic levels of output in mid-2022. Although it's fair to say that there's a lot of uncertainty around that estimate, with upside and downside scenarios painting a very different picture. It's also fair to say that this is what the OBR thought in July, and we're expecting them to opine tomorrow about the future path of economic growth, given the changes in policy that have taken place in the last month or so. Looking at business surveys, there's varying levels of optimism among business. Those industries that have been least able to trade through lockdown, for instance, accommodation and food, the arts, some support services, report the highest risk of insolvency and the lowest confidence that their business would survive the next 3 months. These are all taken from a survey that comes out every 2 weeks from the Office for National Statistics. Turning to external forecasters such as Atradius and Euler Hermes, which are large trade credit organisations that do regular forecasts of corporate insolvencies. They expect UK corporate insolvencies to be around 1/4 to 1/3 higher in 2021 than they had been in 2019. Compared with other countries, those organisations put us broadly in the middle of the pack when it comes to that rate of change. It's also worth highlighting here, it's hard to tell from the minute figures on that table, but the fact that the UK has experienced a decrease in corporate insolvencies is not unique to the UK. It has more or less happened globally. Turning to the context for individual insolvency, unemployment is one factor that puts household finances under strain. This is what the OBR thought in July might happen to unemployment over the next few years. We will see tomorrow what they think based on the latest figures that they're seeing, but they had thought that unemployment would peak quite soon and unwind quite slowly. Research by the Bank of England has shown that the pandemic has had a more profound effect on lower income households, those households that would already have a higher propensity to come into insolvency. The chart on the left indicates that those lowest income households were more likely to have increased expenditure because of COVID-19, with the highest income households least likely to have that higher expenditure. This is all fed through to savings, shown in the chart on the right, with the lowest income households most likely to report lower savings due to COVID-19. This then filters through to what money advice organisations are seeing. They've been doing a great deal of research over the last few months, and these bullet points give us a bit of a flavour of that. I'm not going to read them out, but what I take from it is that in common with insolvencies, the demand for debt advice has been lower than what might be considered normal, but that those money advice organisations are gearing up for an increase in the near future. So to try and sum up, it's clear from the data that there has been a profound impact of coronavirus on business and society, and an equally large response from the UK government to support business and individuals. Insolvency, however, has been the dog that hasn't barked, no doubt partly because of that package of support, including the legislation passed in June. We are, of course, keeping a very close eye on insolvencies and what external organisations are predicting in this space, but the situation is continually evolving with a very uncertain outlook. I don't have a payoff that says how many insolvencies there are going to be next year, but I'm anticipating that that's going to be the question next. So I'll hand over back to Laura.
Thank you, John. Yeah, we've had another couple of questions come through. This one asks, given the public focus on retailers in particular, would the Insolvency Service consider producing sector-specific graphs for that sector? And the question asker says that the statistics are available.
Yes, so our quarterly series, within the quarterly series, we do present in charts the numbers of insolvencies by sector. We use the standard industrial classification to break that down. We don't present that information in charts within the monthly series, although as the requesters asked, as mentioned, we do have breakdowns down to the 3-level SIC code within our table, so the information is all there. The main reason we don't have the charts in the monthly tables is really so that we can churn out the top level, high level figures to end users as quickly as possible, and providing all the supplementary information alongside that. That said, the statistics are there to be reviewed, and we're always happy to consider how we present our findings to better meet user need.
Thank you. And we've been asked whether these slides will be made available, and John's just replied to that one in the affirmative. Yep, these slides will be available for anybody who wants to view them after the session. We don't really have any other questions. We have a comment from David noting that reduced advice sector capacity is also likely to have contributed to the decline in DROs since the lockdown. Do we have any views on that? Thank you for that contribution, David.
Thank you.
Only that from conversations with our operational leads here, that yes, that's what they're hearing as well. It's the Money and Pension Service, I believe, has put aside some funding to increase the capacity in the short term in the debt advice sector, which may well materialise, crystallise it in higher numbers of DROs.
Excellent.
And just in response to someone's comment about the higher volume of moratoria and restructuring plans, we are aware that numbers have increased since we last published our stats, which was at the end of October. So if there are any increases, then they will be reflected within our next statistics for covering November, which will go out in the mid-December. If there have been any changes, as I say, they will be reflected.
Thank you, Kate. And do we anticipate there being further legislative intervention by the government past Q1 2021 to try and hold back the expected tide of corporate and individual insolvencies?
I can't say for certain. It is true, though, that our policy team and policy teams across government are working round the clock to try and mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on as many aspects of business and society as they can. The Chancellor has, however, been clear before that despite all the measures that can be put into place, he's not going to be able to save every business or every job.
Thank you, John. And do we envisage that the EU transition will have an impact on insolvencies going forward?
A very hard one to judge, and I'm not sure how you would unpick it from the wider situation that's going on. It's fair to say that the Department for Business and others are putting in a lot of work to try and make sure that businesses are ready for that transition, to try and mitigate any kind of impact on the ability of businesses to trade. But we don't collect any data on whether insolvencies, say, are because of Brexit. I think it would just be too hard to unpick.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here. Do you think individual bankruptcies will continue on a relatively flat trend, given the higher prevalence and take-up of other options such as DROs and IVAs?
I think I'll take this one. The Insolvency Service, the analysts we've got here have got the same trouble that analysts in other government departments have, in that this is just, the word unprecedented is overused, I guess, so I can't think of another one offhand, but the outlook is extremely uncertain. That makes putting precise figures on what we expect to come through in insolvencies very, very difficult. The models that we used to use that might link changes in insolvencies to changes in debt, they've just been broken effectively since earlier this year. What that means is that we're having to rely more on narrative evidence, more on working with stakeholders to try and understand what's going on the ground and be prepared operationally for a range of outcomes. That's something that is really exercising our exec team and others, is to try and prepare for potentially a very wide range of potential outcomes. I realise I haven't really answered the question there, but I'm afraid that's as good as I can give.
It sounded good to me. We don't have any more questions. We've had another comment from David noting that MAPS has secured an additional 38 million for debt advice, but just pointing out that it does take longer to process the cases at the moment because it's being done remotely, face-to-face advice not being available, so that's likely to impact on future capacity. That's just something to bear in mind when considering the stats going forward in that area. Oh, we've just had one more pop in. Let's see what this one says. Do you think that a reduction in available income might impact negatively on IVAs? I presume that means household income.
I'm not quite sure whether the question is on new IVAs or on the sustainability of IVAs.
I'm not sure. Maybe David could just clarify in the chat if he wants to come back on that one. Perhaps that's something we could discuss later. We don't actually have any other questions unless anybody wants to pop any in the Q&A now. I think we're all good. Oh, hold on, we've got one more. Oh, David's asking.
Okay.
David says both, so he's
So-
asking on both levels there on the impact on IVAs.
Yeah, okay. So the sustainability point first, I believe it's the case that that IVA providers and the Insolvency Service have been working to make sure that where customers have got a temporary drop in income, that they can try and get some sort of variation to their IVA to make sure they can continue making their repayments. As far as new IVAs go, all I would say is to encourage people to seek debt advice to get the right solution for their needs, whatever their income level.
Okay, thank you, John. We don't have any more new questions, so.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I dare say you can ask similarly crunchy questions to our exec team shortly, and they'll be very happy to take them. And in the slides which will be available, there's also an email address for the statistics team. So if you do have any other questions, we will try and answer them if we can.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.